evening, and welcome to Renton Civic Theater presents Scary Stories to be Told in the Dark. Tonight's first episode, The Toll House by W.W. Jacobs. A local haunted house with an evil reputation. Would you be willing to spend the night?
"It's all nonsense," said Jack Barnes. "Of course people have died in the house. People die in every house. As for the noises, wind in the chimneys and rats in the wainscot are very convincing to a nervous man. Give me another cup of tea, Meagle." "Lester and White are first," said Meagle, who was presiding at the tea table of the Three Feathers Inn. "You've had two." Lester and White finished their cups with irritating slowness, pausing between sips to sniff the aroma and to discover the sex and dates of arrival of the strangers which floated in some numbers in the beverage. Mr. Meagle served them to the brim, and then, turning to the grimly expectant Mr. Barnes, blandly requested him to ring for hot water. "We'll try and keep your nerves in their present healthy condition," he remarked. "For my part, I have sort of half and half belief in the supernatural." "All sensible people have," said Lester. "An aunt of mine saw a ghost once." White nodded. "I had an uncle that saw one," he said. "It is always somebody else that sees them," said Barnes. "Well, there is a house," said Meagle. "A large house at an absurdly low rent, and nobody will take it. It has taken toll of at least one life of every family that has ever lived there, however short the time. And since it has stood empty, caretaker after caretaker has died there. The last caretaker died 15 years ago. "Exactly," said Barnes. "Long enough ago for legends to accumulate." "Well, I bet you a sovereign you won't spend the night there alone, for all your talk," said White suddenly. "And I," said Lester. "No," said Barnes slowly, "I don't believe in ghosts, nor in any supernatural things whatever. All the same, I admit that I should not care to pass a night there alone." "But why not?" inquired White. "Wind in the chimney," Meagle said with a grin. "Rats in the wainscot," chimed in Lester. "As you like," said Barnes, coloring. "Suppose we all go," said Meagle. "Start after supper and get there about 11. We have been walking for 10 days now without an adventure, except Barnes's discovery that ditch water smells the longest. It will be a novelty at any rate, and if we break this spell by all surviving, the grateful owner ought to come down handsome." "Let's see what the landlord has to say first," said Lester. "There is no fun in passing the night in an ordinary empty house. Let's make sure that it is haunted." He rang the bell and, sending for the landlord, appealed to him in the name of our common humanity not to let them waste a night watching in a house in which specters and hobgoblins had no part. The reply was more than reassuring, and the landlord, after describing with considerable art the exact appearance of a head which had been seen hanging out of a window in the moonlight, wound up with a polite but urgent request that they would settle his bill before they went. "It's all very well for you young gentlemen to have your fun," he said indulgently, "but supposing as how you are all found dead in the morning, what about me? It ain't called the Toll House for nothing, you know." "Who died here last?" inquired Barnes, with an air of polite derision. "A tramp," was the reply. "He went there for the sake of half a crown, and they found him next morning hanging from the balusters, dead." "Suicide?" said Barnes. "Unsound mind?" The landlord nodded. "That's what the jury brought it in," he said slowly. "But his mind was sound enough when he went in there. I'd known him off and on for years. I'm a poor man, but I wouldn't spend a night in that house for £100. He repeated this remark as they started on their expedition a few hours later. They left as the inn was closing for the night. Bolts shot noisily behind them, and as the regular customers trudged slowly homeward, they set off at a brisk pace in their direction of the house. Most of the cottages were already in darkness, and lights in the others went out as they passed. "It seems rather hard that we have got to lose a night's rest in order to convince Barnes of the existence of ghosts," said White. "It's all in a good cause," said Meagle. "A most worthy object, and something seems to tell me that we shall succeed. You didn't forget the candles, Lester." "I brought 2, was the reply, "all the old man could spare." There was but little moon, and the night was cloudy. The road between the high hedges was dark, and in one place, where it ran through a wood, so black that they twice stumbled in the uneven ground at the side of it. "Fancy leaving our comfortable beds for this," said White again. "Let me see. This desirable residential sepulchre lies to the right, doesn't it?" "Farther on," said Meagle. They walked on for some time in silence, broken only by White's tribute to the softness, the cleanliness, and the comfort of the bed, which he was receding farther and farther into the distance. Under Meagle's guidance, they turned oft at last to the right, and, after a walk of a quarter-mile, saw the gates of the house before them. The lodge was almost hidden by overgrown shrubs, and the drive was choked with rank growths. Meagle leading, they pushed through it until the dark pile of the house loomed above them. "There is a window at the back where we can get in, so the landlord says," said Lester, as they stood before the hall door. "Window," said Meagle. "Nonsense. Let's do this thing properly. Where's the knocker?" He felt for it in the darkness and gave a thundering rat-tat-tat at the door. "Don't play the fool," said Barnes crossly. "Ghostly servants are asleep," said Meagle gravely. "But I'll wake them up before I've done with them. It's scandalous keeping us out here in the dark." He plied the knocker again, and the noise volleyed in the emptiness beyond. Then, with a sudden exclamation, he put out his hands and stumbled forward. "Why, it's been open all the time," he said, with an odd catch in his voice. "Come on." "I don't believe it was open," said Lester, hanging back. "Somebody is playing us a trick." "Nonsense," said Meagle sharply. "Give me a candle." "Thanks. Who's got a match?" Barnes produced a box and struck one, and Meagle, shielding the candle with his hand, led the way forward to the foot of the stairs. "Shut the door, somebody," he said. "It's too much draught." It is shut," said White, glancing behind him. Meagle fingered his chin. "Who shut it?" he inquired, looking from one to the other. "Who came in last?" "I did," said Lester, "but I don't remember shutting it. Perhaps I did, though." Meagle, about to speak, thought better of it, and, still carefully guarding the flame, began to explore the house, with the others close behind. Shadows danced on the walls and lurked in the corners as they proceeded. At the end of the passage they found a second staircase, and ascending it slowly gained the first floor. "Careful," said Meagle, as they gained the landing. He held the candle forward and showed where the balusters had broken away. Then he peered curiously into the void beneath. "This is where the tramp hanged himself, I suppose," he said thoughtfully. "You've got an unwholesome mind," said White as they walked on. "This place is quite creepy enough without your remembering that. Now let's find a comfortable room and have a little nip of whiskey apiece and a pipe. How will this do?" He opened a door at the end of the passage and revealed a small, square room. Meagle led the way with the candle and, first melting a drop or two of tallow, stuck it on the mantelpiece. The others seated themselves on the floor and watched pleasantly as White drew from his pocket a small bottle of whiskey and a tin cup. "I've forgotten the water," he exclaimed. "I'll soon get some," said Meagle. He tugged violently at the bell handle, and the rusty jangling of a bell sounded from a distant kitchen. He rang again. "Don't play the fool," said Barnes roughly. Meagle laughed. "I only wanted to convince you," he said kindly. "There ought to be at any rate one ghost in the servants' hall." Barnes held up his hand for silence. "Yes," said Meagle with a grin at the other two. "Is anybody coming?" "Suppose we drop this game and go back," said Barnes suddenly. "I don't believe in spirits, but nerves are outside anybody's command. You may laugh as you like, but it really seemed to me that I heard a door open below and steps on the stair." His voice was drowned out in a roar of laughter. "He's coming around," said Meagle with a smirk. "By the time I have done with him, he will be a confirmed believer. Well, he will go and get some water." "Will you, Barnes?" "No," was the reply. "If there is any, it might not be safe to drink after all these years," said Lester. "We must do without." Meagle nodded, and taking a seat on the floor, held out his hand for the cup. Pipes were lit, and the clean, wholesome smell of tobacco filled the room. White produced a pack of cards. Talk and laughter rang through the room and died away reluctantly in distant corridors. "Empty rooms always delude me into the belief that I possess a deep voice," said Meagle. "Tomorrow," he started up with a smothered exclamation as the light went out suddenly, and something struck him on the head. The others sprang to their feet. Then Meagle laughed. "It's the candle," he exclaimed. "I didn't stick it enough." Barnes struck a match and, relighting the candle, stuck it on the mantelpiece, and sitting down, took up his cards again. "What was I going to say? Oh, yes. I know. Tomorrow Listen," said White, laying his hand on the other's sleeve. "Upon my word, I really thought I heard a laugh." "Look here," said Barnes. "What do you say to going back? I've had enough of this. I keep fancying that I hear things too. Sounds of something moving about in the passage outside. I know it's only fancy, but it's uncomfortable." "You go if you want to," said Meagle, "and we will play dummy. Or you might ask the tramp to take your hand for you as you go downstairs." Barnes shivered and exclaimed angrily. He got up and walked to the door half closed, listened. "Go outside," said Meagle, winking at the other two. "I'll dare you to go down to the hall door and back yourself." Barnes came back and, bending forward, lit his pipe at the candle. "I am nervous, but rational," he said, blowing out a thin cloud of smoke. "My nerves tell me there is something prowling up and down the long passage outside. My reason tells me that it is all nonsense. Where are my cards?" He sat down again, and taking up his hand, looked through it carefully and led. "Your play, White," he said after a pause. White made no sign. "Why, he's asleep," said Meagle. "Wake up, old man. Wake up and play." Lester, who was sitting next to him, took the sleeping man by the arm and shook him, gently at first, and then with some roughness. But White, with his back against the wall and his head bowed, made no sign. Meagle bawled in his ear and then turned a puzzling face to the others. "He sleeps like the dead," he says, grimacing. "Well, there are still 3 of us to keep each other company." "Yes," said Lester, nodding. "Unless, good Lord, suppose—" He broke off and eyed them trembling. "Suppose what?" inquired Meagle. "Nothing," stammered Lester. Let's wake him. Trying him again. White! "It's no good," said Meagle seriously. "There's something wrong about that sleep." "That's what I meant," said Lester. "And if he goes to sleep like that, why shouldn't—" Meagle sprang to his feet. "Nonsense," he said roughly. "He's tired out, that's all. Still, let's take him and clear out. You take his legs, and Barnes, will you lead the way with the candle?" "Yes? Who's that?" He looked up quickly toward the door. "Thought I heard somebody tap," he said, with a shamefaced laugh. "Now, Lester, up with him. 1, 2. Lester! He sprang forward too late. Lester, with his face buried in his arms, had rolled over on the floor fast asleep, and his utmost efforts failed to awaken him. He is asleep," he stammered. "Asleep." Barnes, who had taken the candle from the mantelpiece, stood peering at the sleepers in silence and dropping tallow all over the floor. "We must get out of this," said Meagle. "Quick!" Barnes hesitated. "We can't leave them here," he began. "We must," said Meagle in strident tones. "If you go to sleep, I shall go. Quick, come!" He seized the other by the arm and strove to drag him to the door. Barnes shook him off and, putting the candle back on the mantelpiece, tried again to arouse the sleepers. "It's no good," he said, and last turning from them watched Meagle. "Don't you go to sleep," he said anxiously. Meagle shook his head, and they stood for some time in uneasy silence. "May as well shut the door," said Barnes at last. He crossed over and closed it gently. Then, at a scuffling noise behind him, he turned and saw Meagle in a heap on the hearthstone. With a sharp catch in his breath, he stood motionless. Inside the room, the candle, fluttering in the draught, showed dimly the grotesque attitudes of the sleepers. Beyond the door, there seemed to his overwrought imagination a strange and stealthy unrest. He tried to whistle, but his lips were parched, and in a mechanical fashion he stooped and began to pick up the cards which littered the floor. He stopped once or twice, stood with bent head listening. The unrest outside seemed to increase, a loud creaking sound from the stairs. "Who's there?" he cried loudly. The creaking ceased. He crossed to the door and, flinging it open, strode out into the corridor. As he walked, his fears left him suddenly. "Come on," he cried with a low laugh. All of you, show your faces, your infernal ugly faces. Don't skulk." He laughed again and walked on, and the heap in the fireplace put out his head tortoise fashion and listened in horror to the retreating footsteps. Not until they had become audible in the distance did the listener's features relax. "Good Lord, Lester, we've driven him mad," he said in a frightened whisper. "We must go after him." There was no reply. Meagle sprung to his feet. "Do you hear? Stop fooling around now. This is serious. White, Lester, do you hear?" He bent and surveyed them in angry bewilderment. "All right," he said in a trembling voice. "You won't frighten me, you know." He turned away and walked with exaggerated carelessness in the direction of the door. He even went outside and peeped through the crack, but the sleepers did not stir. He glanced into the blackness behind and then came hastily into the room again. He stood for a few seconds regarding them. The stillness in the house was horrible. He could not even hear them breathe. With a sudden resolution, he snatched the candle from the mantelpiece and held the flame to White's finger. Then, as he reeled back, stupefied, the footsteps again became audible. He stood with the candle in a shaking hand listening. He heard them ascending the farther staircase, but they stopped suddenly as he went to the door. He walked a little way along the passage, and they went scurrying down the stairs, and then at a jog trot along the corridor below. He went back to the main staircase, and they ceased again. For a time, he hung over the balusters, listening and trying to pierce the blackness below. Then slowly, step by step, he made his way downstairs, and holding the candle above his head, peered about him. "Barnes," he called, "where are you?" Shaking with fright, he made his way along the passage, and summoning up all his courage, pushed open doors and gazed fearfully into empty rooms. Then, quite suddenly, he heard the footsteps in front of him. He followed slowly, for fear of extinguishing the candle, until they led him at last into a vast bare kitchen with damp walls and a broken floor. In front of him, a door leading into an outside room had closed. He ran toward it and flung it open, and a cold air blew out the candle. He stood aghast. "Barnes!" he cried again. "Don't be afraid. It is I, Meagle." There was no answer. He stood gazing into the darkness, and all the time the idea of something close at hand watching was upon him. Then suddenly the steps broke out overhead again. He drew back hastily, and passing through the kitchen, groped his way along the narrow passages. He could now see better in the darkness, and finding himself at last at the foot of the staircase, began to ascend it noiselessly. He reached the landing just in time to see a figure disappear around the angle of the wall. Still careful to make no noise, he followed the sound of the steps until they led him to the top floor, and he cornered the chase at the end of the short passage. "Barnes!" he whispered. "Barnes!" Something stirred in the darkness. A small circular window at the end of the passage just softened the blackness and revealed the dim outlines of a motionless figure. Meagle, in place of advancing, stood almost as still, as a sudden horrible doubt took possession of him. With his eyes fixed on the shape in front, he fell back slowly and, as it advanced upon him, burst into a terrible cry. "Barnes! For God's sake! Is it you?" The echoes of his voice left the air quivering, but the figure before him paid no heed. For a moment he tried to brace his courage up to endure its approach. Then, with a smothered cry, he turned and fled. The passages wound like a maze, and he threaded them blindly in a vain search for the stairs. If he could get down and open the hall door. He caught his breath in a sob. The steps had begun again. At a lumbering trot, they clattered up and down the bare passages, in and out, up and down, as though in search of him. He stood appalled, and then, as they drew near, entered a small room and stood behind the door as they rushed by. He came out and ran swiftly and noiselessly in the other direction, and in a moment the steps were after him. He found the long corridor and raced along it at top speed. The stairs he knew were at the end, and with the steps close behind, he descended them in blind haste. The steps gained on him, and he shrank to the side to let them pass, still continuing his headlong flight. Then suddenly he seemed to slip off the earth into space. Lester woke in the morning to find the sunshine streaming into the room, and White sitting up and regarding with some perplexity the badly blistered finger. "Where are the others?" inquired Lester. "Gone, I suppose," said White. "We must have been asleep." Lester arose and, stretching his stiffened limbs, dusted his clothes with his hands and went out into the corridor. White followed. At the noise of their approach, a figure which had been lying asleep at the other end sat up and revealed the face of Barnes. "Why, I've been asleep," he said in surprise. "I don't remember coming here. How did I get here?" "Nice place to come for a nap," said Lester severely as he pointed to the gap in the balusters. "Look there!" Another yard, and where would you have been? He walked carelessly to the edge and looked over. In response to his startled cry, the others drew near, and all three stood gazing at the dead man below.
Tonight's second episode, A Ghost Story by Mark Twain. You have taken a room in a neglected building in Manhattan. As the night wears on, you have feelings of superstitious dread. What can that mean?
A Ghost Story by Mark Twain. I took a large room far up Broadway in a huge old building whose upper stories had been wholly unoccupied for years until I came. The place had long been given up to dust and cobwebs, to solitude and silence. I seemed groping among the tombs and invading the privacy of the dead that first night I climbed up into my quarters. For the first time in my life, a superstitious dread came over me, and as I turned a dark angle of the stairway and an invisible cobweb swung its slazy woof in my face and clung there, I shuddered as one who had encountered a phantom. I was glad enough when I reached my room and locked out the mold in the darkness. A cheery fire was burning in the grate, and I sat down before it with a comforting sense of relief. For 2 hours I sat there, thinking of bygone times, recalling old scenes, and summoning half-forgotten faces out of the mists of the past, listening in fancy to voices that long ago grew silent for all time, and to once familiar songs that nobody sings now. And as my reverie softened down to a sadder and sadder pathos, the shrieking of the winds outside softened to a wail, and angry beating of the rain against the panes diminished to a tranquil patter, and one by one the noises in the street subsided, until the hurrying footsteps of the last belated straggler died away in the distance and left no sound behind. The fire had burned low. A sense of loneliness crept over me. I arose and undressed, moving on tiptoe about the room, doing stealthily what I had to do, as if I were environed by sleeping enemies whose slumbers it would be fatal to break. I covered up in bed and lay listening to the rain and wind and the faint creaking of distant shutters till they lulled me to sleep. I slept profoundly, but how long I do not know. All at once I found myself awake and filled with a shuddering expectancy. All was still. All but my own heart. I could hear it beat. Presently the bedclothes began to slip away slowly towards the foot of the bed, as if someone were pulling them. I could not stir. I could not speak. Still the blankets slipped deliberately away till my breast was uncovered. Then with great effort I seized them and drew them over my head. I waited, listened, waited. Once more that steady pull began, and once more I lay torpid, a century of dragging seconds, till my breast was naked again. At last I roused my energies and snatched the covers back to their place and held them with a strong grip. I waited. By and by, I felt a faint tug and took a fresh grip. The tug strengthened to a steady strain. It grew stronger and stronger. My hold parted, and for third time the blanket slid away. I groaned. An answering groan came from the foot of the bed. Beaded drops of sweat stood upon my forehead. I was more dead than alive. Presently I heard a heavy footstep in my room. The step of an elephant, it seemed to me. It was not like anything human. But it was moving from me. There was relief in that. I heard it approach the door, pass out without moving bolt or lock, and wander away among the dismal corridors, straining the floors and joists till they creaked again as it passed, and then silence reigned once more. When my excitement had calmed, I said to myself, "This is a dream, simply a hideous dream." And so I lay thinking it over until I convinced myself that it was a dream, and then a comforting laugh relaxed my lips, and I was happy again. I got lay up and struck a light, and when I found that the locks and bolts were just as I had left them, another soothing laugh welled in my heart and rippled from my lips. I took my pipe and lit it, and was just sitting down before the fire, when down with the pipe out of my nerveless fingers. The blood forsook my cheeks, and my placid breathing was cut short with a gasp. In the ashes of the hearth, side by side with my own bare footprint, was another, so vast that in comparison mine was but an infant's. Then I had a visitor, and the elephant tread was explained. I put out the light and returned to bed, palsied with fear. I lay a long time peering into the darkness and listening. Then I heard a grating noise overhead, like the dragging of a heavy body across the floor, then the throwing down of the body, and the shaking of my windows in response to the concussion. In distant parts of the building, I heard the muffled slamming of doors. I heard at intervals stealthy footsteps creeping in and out among the corridors and up and down the stairs. Sometimes these noises approached my door, hesitated, and went away again. I heard the clanking of chains faintly in remote passages, and listened while the clanking grew nearer, while it warily climbed the stairways, marking each move by the loose surplus of chain that fell with an accented rattle upon each succeeding step, as the goblin that bore it advanced. I heard muttered sentences, half-uttered screams that seemed smothered violently, and the swish of invisible garments, that rush of invisible wings. Then I became conscious that my chamber was invaded, that I was not alone. I heard sighs and breathing about my bed, and mysterious whisperings. 3 little spheres of soft phosphorescent light appeared on the ceiling directly over my head, clung and glowed there a moment, and then dropped. 2 of them upon my face, and 1 upon the pillow. They spattered liquidly and felt warm. Intuition told me they had turned to gouts of blood as they fell. I needed no light to satisfy myself on that. Then I saw pallid faces, dimly luminous and white, uplifted hands, floating bodiless in the air, floating a moment and then disappearing. The whispering ceased, and the voices and the sounds and the solemn stillness followed. I waited and listened. I felt that I must have light or die. I was weak with fear. I slowly raised myself toward a sitting posture, and my face came in contact with a clammy hand. All strength went from me, apparently, and I fell back like a stricken invalid. Then I heard the rustle of a garment. It seemed to pass to the door and go out. When everything was still once more, I crept out of bed, sick and feeble, and lit the gas with a hand that trembled, as if it were aged with 100 years. The light brought some little cheer to my spirits. I sat down and fell into a dreamy contemplation of that great footprint in the ashes. By and by its outlines began to waver and grow dim. I glanced up, and the broad gas flame was slowly wilting away. In the same moment I heard that elephantine tread again. I noted its approach, nearer and nearer along the musty halls, and dimmer the light waned. The tread reached my very door and paused. The light had dwindled to a sickly blue, and all things about me in a spectral twilight. The door did not open, and yet I felt a faint gust of air fan my cheek, and presently was conscious of a huge, cloudy presence before me. I watched it with fascinated eyes. A pale glow stole over the thing. Gradually its cloudy folds took shape. An arm appeared, then legs, then a body, and at last a great, sad face looked out of the vapor. Stripped of its filmy housings, naked, muscular, and comely, the majestic Cardiff giant loomed above me. All my misery vanished, for a child might know that no harm could come with that benignant countenance. My cheerful spirits returned at once, and in sympathy with them, the gas flamed up brightly again. Never a lonely outcast was so glad to welcome company. I was to greet the friendly giant. I said, "Why, is it nobody but you? Do you know, I have been scared to death for the last 2 or 3 hours. I am most honestly glad to see you. I wish I had a chair. Here, don't try to sit down in that thing." But it was too late. He was in it before I could stop him, and down he went. I never saw a chair shivered so in my life. Stop, you'll ruin Too late again. There was another crash, and another chair was resolved into its original elements. Confound it! Haven't you got any judgment at all? Do you want to ruin all the furniture on the place? Here, you petrified fool! But it was no use. Before I could arrest him, he had sat down on the bed, and it was a melancholy ruin. Now what sort of way is that to do? First you come lumbering about the place, bringing a legion of vagabond goblins along with you to worry me to death, and then when I overlook an indelicacy of costume which would not be tolerated anywhere by cultivated people except in a respectable theatre, and not even there if the nudity were of your sex, you repay me by wrecking all the furniture you can find to sit down on. And why will you? You damage yourself as much as you do me. You have broken off the end of your spinal column and littered up the floor with the chips of your hams till the place looks like a marble yard. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You are big enough to know better. Well, I will not break any more furniture. But what am I to do? I have not had a chance to sit down for a century. And the tears came to his eyes. Poor devil, I said. I should not have been so harsh with you. And you are an orphan too, no doubt. But sit down on the floor here. Nothing else can stand your weight. And besides, we cannot be sociable with you away up there above me. I want you down where I can perch on this high counting-house stool and gossip with you face to face. So he sat down on the floor and lit a pipe, which I gave him, threw one of my red blankets over his shoulders, inverted my sitz bath on his head, helmet fashion, and made himself picturesque and comfortable. Then he crossed his ankles while I renewed the fire and exposed the flat honeycomb bottoms of his prodigious feet to the grateful warmth. What is the matter with the bottom of your feet and the back of your legs, that they are all gouged up so? Infernal chilblains! I caught them clear up to the back of my head, roosting out there under Newell's farm. But I love the place. I love it as one loves his old home. There is no peace for me like the peace I feel when I am there. We talked along for half an hour, and then I noticed that he looked tired and spoke of it. Tired? He said. Well, I should think so. And now I will tell you all about it, since you have treated me so well. I am the spirit of the petrified man that lies across the street there in the museum. I am the ghost of the Cardiff giant. I can have no rest, no peace till they have given that poor body burial again. Now what was the most natural thing for me to do? To make men satisfy this wish, terrify them into it, haunt the place where the body lay. So I haunted the museum night after night. I even got other spirits to help me, but it did no good, for nobody ever came to the museum at midnight. Then it occurred to me to come over the way and haunt this place a little. I felt that if I ever got a hearing I must succeed, for I had the most efficient company that perdition could furnish. Night after night we have shivered around through these mildewed halls, dragging chains, groaning, whispering, tramping up and down the stairs, till, to tell you the truth, I am almost worn out. But when I saw a light in your room tonight, I roused my energies again and went at it with a deal of an old freshness. But I am tired out, entirely fagged out. Give me, I beseech you, give me some hope. I lit off my perch in a burst of excitement and exclaimed, This transcends everything! Everything that ever did occur! Why, you poor, blundering old fossil! You have had all your trouble for nothing. You have been haunting a plaster cast of yourself. The real Cardiff giant is in Albany. Confound it, don't you know your own remains? I never saw such an eloquent look of shame, of pitiable humiliation, overspread a countenance before. The petrified man rose slowly to his feet and said, Honestly, is that true? As true as I am sitting here. He took the pipe from his mouth and laid it on the mantel, then stood irresolute a moment, unconsciously from old habit, thrusting his hands where his pantaloons' pockets should have been, and meditatively dropping his chin on his breast, and finally said, Well, I never felt so absurd before. The petrified man has sold everybody else, and now the mean fraud has ended by selling its own ghost. My son, if there's any charity left in your heart for a poor, friendless phantom like me, don't let this get out. Think how you would feel if you had made such an ass of yourself. I heard his stately tramp die away, step by step down the stairs and out into the deserted street, and felt sorry that he was gone, poor fellow, and sorrier still that he had carried off my red blanket and my bathtub. The end.
Thank you for joining us for tonight's performance of The Toll House by W.W. Jacobs, read by John Kelleher, and A Ghost Story by Mark Twain, read by Alyssa Maas. Join us again at the same time tomorrow night for 2 more scary stories to be told in the dark.